then we're able to attend all the sessions. So we are going to post the recordings on our site, and there's been a lot of demand for the recordings as well. So so your
I've started
presentation
them.
will keep giving. Go ahead, Stefan.
Oh, I just started it so that we've
Okay.
got it going.
Great, thank you.
All right, why don't we get started then? Welcome everyone to the International Conference on Community-Based Service Learning in Borneo. And it's great to see you all here. And we're going to start the session on the community-based research methodology. And we have Scott Peters here, who is a faculty member in the global development at Cornell, who has been working on a project with myself, and along with the most important critical folks are also joining us here, our Cornell Civic Leader Fellows, which is a program that runs through the Public Service Center. It was one of the programs, I would like to say, very unique at Cornell, maybe unique in the US in recognizing, acknowledging, and honoring the knowledge and the of our community members, activists, human services professionals. There's just recognition and honoring the knowledge that they also provide, that it's not just only reside on the university base. They bring in so much knowledge, bring so much skills and live experiences that really provides, that really help us rethink and challenge us in what is considered to be knowledge, and how do we make meanings, and making meanings, and building social movements and for a better world. So we have Jamila Walida Simon with us, along with Jessica Belgrave, who are both former Civic Leader Fellows. But and we hope that Phoebe Brown will also be joining us soon, who's also one of the Civic Leader Fellow. I'd like to just quote from her that says, once you're a Civic Leader Fellow, you're always a Civic Leader Fellow. And so from that experience, it really brought light to me in terms of the amount of the live experience, that the knowledge that they have in addressing social inequity, racism, and xenophobia, and food insecurity, and all these issues. I don't want to keep naming all of them, unfortunately, and the list goes on, right? So, but learning through them and working, most important, working collaboratively with them, it really brings on lights on how we can better bring university and community, with students, with faculty, with staff, and everyone involved to address these critical issues. So from that, with Dr. Scott Peters helped, and with his class, that we'll go a little bit more in terms of how do we use stories? How do we use stories? How do we collect stories? How we, not in the static way, but using stories as a way to not only build relationship, but also building legacy, and building how do we build forward an outlook, especially training the new generation of activists. And so, so I'm going to turn over that to Scott to continue with the sessions today.
Thanks, Amy. Can you put the PowerPoint up?
Yep.
So it's wonderful to be here today with all of you. I'm just going to give a little bit more detail to the background of this, building off of what Amy just said, before introducing our partners, colleagues here in this work, for them to share their experience in the project. So we've called this Telling Stories to Change the World. And around the world, people are rediscovering the power of oral histories and stories. And so as tools for learning, as tools for communicating knowledge, as tools for making change. If you go to the next slide. So we always have to begin with our acknowledgement, our land acknowledgement. We're coming to you from indigenous land, and recently in the United States, there has been a renewed effort at studying the origins of the land that was given to states, and like New York State, that helped establish universities like Cornell University, which is a land grant university. So recently there's been a study that has helped uncover the origins of that land and how it was stolen. It was grabbed and stolen. The indigenous populations were dispossessed over a long period of time in this country. And so we are increasingly wanting to acknowledge the ownership of this land. And we are beginning efforts to work on the implications of this for our responsibilities and obligations today. At Cornell, we have an Indigenous Studies program that has a team of people working on that, and we're joining with them. If you could go to the next slide. So what we want to do is provide just a very brief background to the project that we did. Then we're going to have each of the Civic Fellows, our colleagues who are with us today, to introduce themselves by responding to 4 questions that you will see in a second on the slide. And then we will, after they're finished, we will open for a conversation for questions or anything that people might have to share from their own experience. Okay, Amy, one more. So this is a wonderful little photo of the 13 community leaders that we worked with on this project that eventually ended up in a book. This little collage was actually made by my students who took my senior capstone class in development sociology this past semester. What we were celebrating at the end of this past semester was the completion of a project that we began in the fall of 2016, when the Civic Fellow program that Amy mentioned was just turning 15 years old. And at that period, we were very interested in trying to understand how this program might have had an impact on the leaders that participated in it. We wanted to know more about its meaning and its significance. And actually, more importantly, we were very concerned about the future survival of this program. There were some question in the air about whether the program would continue. So we decided, working with alumni from the program, all of whom you see here in this collage, we decided that we would have students who are taking my capstone class do these oral history interviews of the civic leaders, Civic Fellows, in order for them to share their stories of their powerful work in community, and both as individuals and as members of larger collectives of organizations and movements. Because we were pretty sure that those stories would be very powerful, and they would be good opportunity for students to learn. But we were also pretty sure that the experience of sharing the story might also be of value to the community leaders, and they will share their own perspective on that in a second. It took us 5 years, but we finally produced this book. This is the cover of the book. I am going to put in the chat right now I just put in the chat a link to the book, so you can go to it and download a copy of it. It's not quite final. We're hoping to incorporate more photographs and illustrations to make the book more visually interesting and appealing, in order to then publish a printed version of the book. We're in the process of working to raise money for that. But anyway, over these 5 years, what happened was that 5 of my senior capstone student classes worked with the civic leaders to edit and refine these stories that the oral histories had helped us to document. And then we put them together in this book. The book includes an introduction, which is a conversation with 3 of the civic fellows about their work and about how they hoped people would read this book and what they might get out of it. One of the students who took the capstone course this past semester wrote an afterword for the book. She read all of the student reflections over 5 years of the students who had had a chance to read these oral histories, and she wrote an afterword that expresses her view of the value of being able to read these stories and be involved in this project. So there's lots more to say about the background of this, but I don't want to take up time with that. If we go to the next slide, Amy, what we'd like to do is, oh, this is just the table of contents, and we have a Maya Angelou quote here that's very nice, that kind of sets the tone for the book. So one more slide. So when we were talking about this session and putting our thoughts together about what we might do, we just we raised 4 questions that we want to invite our colleagues to introduce themselves and say a few things about. What was the experience like in sharing your story with a student and editing it for publication? What did you learn about the value and power of stories and storytelling? What are you still uncertain about or feel might not have worked very well in the project that we did? And what has your experience with this kind of storytelling revealed about how our individual purpose is shaped by a larger collective purpose? That's one of the powerful things I must say about these stories, is the stories don't just reveal an individual's life history and work, but they show us the stories and work of a collective of people involved in very powerful work in neighborhoods and communities. So the Civic Fellows, our colleagues who will be speaking now, are free to introduce themselves however they would like to, and to share their experience and be involved in this project. Each one will have about 10 minutes or so to speak, and then after they're done, we will open it up for a conversation. So we have, do we just have Jamila and Jessica at the moment? So I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll start. This is Jessica
Jessica.
Garrett. Yes, this is Jessica Garrett, previously Jessica Belgrave. I'm the founder of Mothers Helping Mothers of Elmira, and I did a lot of community and activist work in my community of Elmira, and I'm originally from Newark, New Jersey. So the experience that I had working with the students and getting ready to edit for publication of the book, it was actually inspiring, because to know that another younger generation was interested in the work that we were doing, it kind of gave me that inspiration to keep going, to keep moving, and that someone will be there to pick the work up and keep moving forward, however they decide to pick this work up. What I learned about the value of storytelling, well, storytelling has been a part of my heritage as an African-American woman. So even my mom, you know, our heritage have the folk tales. They tell stories of folk through folktale. So I still remember some stories that my mom told me, and I have since then passed and shared that on with my daughters. So that's been a powerful thing in our heritage for a long time. So I really do understand and genuinely value the way that we tell stories and passing information on. What I'm still uncertain about moving forward with the project, well, I'm uncertain about where this is going to go, which is a good thing, because we can move this forward as fast as we would like, as slow as we would like. Well, the pandemic showed us that, but we were still able to get things done. Long as we have that passion to keep moving this ball, we're going to move it forward. So that's what I was unsure about. The experience, how it rebuild, about how our individual purpose is shaped by a larger collective purpose. Well, what I find with all of the work that the Civic Fellows have done, we all, at the end of all the storytelling, the harvest that I received was the fact that we try to give our community a hand up instead of a hand out, because we all know in the state and condition that this world is in, that we need to know how to eliminate poverty. We need to know how to grow and create the things that we need, such as food and, gardening and supporting one another and, being out there working together. I believe this is what we pulled together and harvest from our storytelling and our lived experience. So that's what I got out of it. And then there was one more. Let me see which question I didn't answer. I believe I did answer all of them. So that's what I received out of it.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm sure you will jump back in as we go forward here.
Yes, thank you.
Jamila.
Thanks, Jessica. Well, my name is Jamila Walida of the House of Simon. I'm the first of her name. I consider myself to be the raiser of future leaders. I'm also not just an auntie, but affectionately referred to as a TT Slayer and best friend of all of my nieces and nephews. I tend to be an expert of efficiency and a slayer of one-liners. I am definitely a breaker of rules and the queen of the Simon dynasty. When I think about what I got from my individual experience with the students in this editing process, I think a lot about remembering who I am and where I currently am in this moment, right? We oftentimes will tell very similar stories, some stories that we affectionately refer to and other stories that are heartfelt and stories that we don't really want to share. And so I think that in that process, they got all of those things. And so it helps us to remember where we currently are, where we've been, and where we'd like to head to. It also helps us to remember the power that we carry with our stories. And so that was something that was really important. A story is not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street, right? It opens a conversation, it opens you to a section and a portion and a time period of someone's life. And so I think that that was really important to remind me in that reflection process. It also reminded me just of the joy of, right, different aspects of my life that were pretty incredible and some things that brought me sadness. But I think that there was, joy and really a lot of lessons learned in each of those parts. There were definitely surprises, right? Twists and turns, like how did I end up in this place? And I think in each of the stories, right, that was revealed where it was like, you might have started off on one path and ended up someplace completely different. And so that emerged as a part of that process. Even as we were picking out images, right, the things that came to mind for the students might not have been the same images that came to mind for us. So there was a dance and a negotiation in that process. But I think that that's valuable, and it creates a value added because we might not have been thinking about it in that particular way, but then it begs a conversation around how it might be internalized by the audience, and then how we want to have things be represented to others or represented. When I think about the value and the power of stories, I also think about the strategies, right, that are used in a particular context, the strategies that we use with one another. At the heart of those stories are helping us to really build relationships, and not just relationships with other people, but also relationships with our own selves, and also with the power that we have within us. I think about some of the divine interventions, right, that we talked about in some of the stories, whether they were published in the newspaper or someone coming to us to give us information. And again, just coming back to those relationships, right? At the heart of the work is helping to build those relationships, not just with students, but in community with one another as civic leader fellows with our colleagues, both Amy and Scott, and also with one another. I think when I think about first, not just the things that didn't go well, when I think about the things that did work well, um, sometimes when we're interviewing people, it feels more like a one-way situation. And I think that in having a conversation and building out these stories and sharing them with students, it became more of a two-way conversation where we could converse about an experience that was had. And then the students can share with us what they got from it, and an audience would be able to share what they took from it. Um, so there was more of an opportunity to listen in, but then to also learn. And again, in that reflection process, you actually sit at your own feet and you learn from, heartfelt stories about, how did I end up in this place? And again, what are the next steps and where am I headed to? I think when I thought about my individual purpose and how it might be connected to a larger purpose, this process actually helped me to really expand my own individual purpose. It helped to enrich my purpose, and also to really think about the ways in which I was connected to others. A lot of folks that I'm connected with are farming. They're stewards of the land. They spend a lot of time dedicated to growing food, and thinking of ways in which they can strategize, helping to build capacity within communities. And so there's a lot of overlap in terms of what our individual purpose might be. But when we look at the collective purpose, right, it's a place for that intersection of, like, what are the things that are really feeding my soul? How can I share the gifts and talents that I manifest in the world? How can I ask for help at times, right? How can I rest and relax and then try it again? And really, how do I build community? And so I think when I'm reflecting on my individual purpose, right, I'm really reflecting on the pathways that lead me to intersections between my purpose, Jessica's purpose, Amy's purpose, Scott's purpose, Shorner's purpose, and how do we come together to build community? And I think that this book is a magnificent way to begin to have that conversation around not just service learning and not just the ways in which we can build capacity in communities, but how can we build better communities where people actually get to know what your story is. You might be in a classroom and never know the story of the student that's sitting next to you. And I think that largely is important as educators and as community leaders for people to know, may not be all of our story, but to know a large portion of our story so that you know how to interact and engage, what the trigger points might be for us, what are some of the pain points, what are the things that bring us joy, so that as we enter into the work, we can honor those parts of each other.
Thanks so much, Jamila. Looks like our other colleague is not able to get into the Zoom, so I'm going to share my screen here. And I'm going to introduce you to Phoebe Brown. This is also will give us a chance for you to see what's inside this book. And it's a little mysterious maybe to some of you what these oral history profiles look like in this book. So I've just turned to Phoebe's. So you can see her there. Each one of these oral histories has a little title. Hers is 2 Lives in One Lifetime. The title is taken from something that the civic leader said. And you can see how this one begins. I was born and raised in Harlem, New York City. My mother is Mavis Brown. And then she talks about what her life was like when she was growing up. And it moves through her life. And here's a photo of her engaged in her work as a community activist and leader. So I'll just stop sharing there. Hopefully, if all of you can take a look at the whole book by checking the link out. I'd like to say that to sort of open this back up for conversation, what Jamila was just talking about speaks to one of the things that I have felt pretty strongly over the 5 years we worked on this project in terms of what I'm still trying to figure out and didn't work as well as I wanted. Um, Jamila mentioned the deep importance and power of sharing stories and of how sometimes, for example, we're sitting next to each other in a classroom or somewhere at a meeting, and we just don't know each other's story. We don't know where each other is coming from. We don't know each other's purpose and where that purpose comes from. All the things Jamila was just saying. What I was doing in the classroom while this was going on is I was inviting students to articulate their story of self, their deep sort of life history. I was inviting them to do is to be able to name what they're most passionate about, what really drives them, what sustains them, what makes them want to enter into community work and life. What is inspiring and motivating and propelling them, and what sustains them. So they were sharing their own stories of self that reveal these really powerful stories, actually just as powerful as the civic leaders' stories. So what I've begun to imagine is we really need to do something that brings those together, that brings the younger people of a new generation together with the community leaders and activists who have their own stories to tell. I think those two stories, if we could find a way to bring those stories together, I could imagine, Jamila, as you were just talking, a whole project of doing what I was hearing you speak to, and of having different kinds of things come out of it, not just a book that we can put online or print, but videos of people talking, audio of people talking, and other kinds of visual representations here. Because these stories are so rich, and they just have so much, there's so much to learn from them beyond just reading them when they get put down on paper. We have to hear the tone of voice. We have to hear somebody's spirit speaking through their words. You can get that actually in a lot of these profiles. They actually are pretty animated, and I can hear it because I can hear everybody's voice. When I read these profiles, I'm hearing their voice say these things. And so it won't be the same for people who do pick up this book. But anyway, at this point, we put a lot on the table that has come out of this powerful work that we've done together. And you've heard some thoughts about what the experience was like. So I'd like to just use the rest of this time for questions and conversation. If people have it, let's just open the floor for that.
I have a question. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for sharing your experience with me. I actually really got a lot out of listening to you talk about the experience and what it meant for you, and particularly how, Jamila, when you said it allowed you to remember your stories and remember where you came from. And the other lady, I'm sorry, I was putting my daughter back to bed, when she was talking about sharing her stories with her daughter and passing them on through generations. When you're sharing your stories, what is it about those stories that resonate within you when you're sharing them? Like I could feel emotionally that they were significant, but what does it mean for you when you're sharing?
Yeah,
Thanks,
it's such a
Jamila?
funny process. Sometimes you want to ad lib, right, and tell the shortened version of the story because you've told it so many times. Other times you don't want to edit it, right? You want to tell them all the things that weren't so fluffy, right? The things that went wrong, like how it went to hell in the handbasket, and but you still came out on the other side, right? And so I think for me, a lot of it is just, I don't necessarily want to tell people, right, we don't have an ending for our story. We're still living, right? And so I don't ultimately want to tell people what the lessons are and what they draw from the story, but I do want to tell a story, right? I want it to have meaning, to have depth, for you to feel like, wow, I was sitting there when she opened the newspaper and figured out, right, that this was her life calling. So I really do want you to enter into that space and then to think about for yourself, right? Where are the intersections in terms of what you're currently doing? Where are the springboards? Where are the sparks that can really send you off and send you reeling into doing something that helps to build capacity within community?
Thank you. Storytelling is really hard. It's not easy. I think you have a certain kind of skill and ability to connect with people through your stories. I tried telling stories and it was just, the audience was like crickets. Great, 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 great. So I just want to acknowledge that and go, that's amazing, because you pick people up and take them with you. So thank you.
Jessica, did you want to share something? You're muted, Jessica.
Yes. When I'm engaged in storytelling, I'm a little bit different because I'm so passionate about the work that I do and the person that I am. And I'm originally from the South. So when I get embedded in the storytelling, a lot of my Southern accents or dialects start coming out. So you're going to see some of that in the book. And when we spoke about correcting those, I decided, no, let's leave that in there because that's truly who I am. And those are my origins. So I'm okay with leaving some of that in there. But what I feel when I'm storytelling, I feel all the emotions of going through that specific experience at that time. And when I speak, people have told me, like, they listen intensely because you grasp them and you hold them there with you and take them through the experience with you. And I didn't know I was doing that, but I know I felt it when I tell my stories and pass things down.
Well, thank you. I felt it when you were both speaking and I was like, oh, wow, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
There are many dimensions to the work we did over this 5 years that I'm still trying to process, and we haven't, I think, adequately talked through. There is a lot of ethics here. We were speaking about candid storytelling, and Jamila was talking about not leaving out failure and not leaving out the kinds of things where things don't work out. We're getting an arc of life story in these interviews, and that's intentional because we know that we can't really understand somebody's work if we don't understand the story of where they've come from and what they've been through. So it becomes important to share that, but the ethics are very important because we don't want this kind of storytelling to hurt anybody. We definitely don't want to collaborate with having somebody hurt themselves. And so for us at a university, the students and faculty, Amy and I working with the students, we had to be very careful to make sure that we were not going to be doing damage to anyone or anything with this kind of storytelling. You will see when you look at the book that there are stories of incarceration. There are several stories of incarceration. And those stories are very candidly told in this book. And we had to spend a lot of time really thinking about, again, the ethics and the implications of sharing, making public that level of detail with people's lives and stories. I will say that one thing that continues to agitate and trouble me, I should take this as a good thing, but I don't take it as a good thing. I take it as something that just makes me angry every time it happens. But every single year in the 5 years when we did this, when students, the first group of students did the oral history interviews, they transcribed them, they edited them working with the civic leader. And then I had each of the 4 following classes over the next 4 years read those oral histories, and then other students work to continue to edit them. Every single time that happens, I would have students tell me that they have never read anything like this. They've never read anything so real, that felt so real. It just makes me so angry that the experience in higher education, in colleges and universities, is one in which students mostly feel like they're reading stuff that isn't real. and they have been reading lots of theory and lots of academic articles and literature, but there's something that's just so dramatically different about reading very candidly told stories of people's lives. And students were really captured by that and really drawn into that. And you can feel the power of the impact in the reflections that all the students who read these wrote in response to them. That agitates me, first of all, because of how it reflects poorly on their education, and the kind of education they're getting at places like Cornell University. And secondly, it disturbs me because I still don't think we've figured out a way in this process to adequately and with full reciprocity share that level of meaning and impact in doing this kind of storytelling. I think what Jamila was talking about earlier is a path to it. If we can find a way to do this in a much more reciprocal kind of way, then, you know, the students were in essence drawing the stories out of the community leaders, and we were doing everything to collaborate to make this meaningful and useful for everyone. But I feel like students got more out of it than the civic leaders did. And one of the things we're doing in relation to that now is we're raising money to print this book, and then we're hoping to take the book on the road to have the civic leaders share it with people in Philadelphia and Newark, New Jersey, and New York City and Baltimore and other places. And that I think can be a great way for this to be used as a tool for building people's networks and power and expanding the circle here. But so I'm sort of left myself with those things that we haven't, I don't think, fully figured out how to adequately deal with. Are there any other questions or comments? It looks like Amanda, you raised a question in the chat.
I did, but Shorna's been itching to.
Sorry.
Oh,
No,
okay.
go ahead, Amanda. Go ahead.
You're fine.
Well, so I'll jump in. I just want to, I guess two things kind of came to mind. I mean, one is that Jamila and Jessica, I mean, you are both really phenomenal storytellers. I mean, the way in which you described your experiences, even in the short time we had here, was just, you know, you speak in relationship to the people that you're talking to, and you really feel that connection as you're talking, the connection between you and what you're talking about, but I think also the connection that you're making with whatever audience it is that you're speaking to. And Jessica, you talked about how you're as growing up, that storytelling was a part of your heritage as an African-American woman. And Jamila, I wondered, you know, how did you learn, you know, both of you, how did you learn the art of storytelling? Because like Faith, I mean, I said as well, it's not easy to do what you all do so expertly. And I know that it comes from experience, it comes from a lot of things. So I was curious how did you develop your art of storytelling?
I think the big thing, right, when I did my introduction, right, so I'm affectionately referred to as a TT. So I have a very large family. So I have a lot of nieces and nephews, but in a large family, right, I had two sets of grandparents who really nurtured and loved on me incredibly. My grandfather was a Freemason, my maternal grandfather, and we always had people in the house. And sometimes what happens when you see people and you don't have an explanation for why they're there, you make up a story in your mind. And I was really good at making up stories in my mind about things that were happening in the world, and then helping, right, working with adults to help make sense of those things. And so I think that storytelling component really came from my grandparents, right? So, you know, I can imagine that everybody in the world had a soundproof basement like my grandparents did. nobody else did, right? So they'd have their secret meetings in the basement, and I used to curate in my mind what they were discussing, right? And then I would, collaborate with my grandfather and say, your meeting must have been about X, Y, and Z. And he would be like, no, it really wasn't, but I'll tell you what it was about, right? And so that was like the very beginning of planting those seeds for how we curate and tell stories. And, I would think of the most elaborate, the most outrageous things. And at the same time, right, that was feeding my sense of curiosity, that was feeding my imagination, so that when I launch myself out into the world, right, there's nothing that I can't dream of, right? And so that lends itself to the work. And that also lends itself to how we recreate and represent our stories.
And for me, it's a sense, well, I remember my grandmother, who's since now passed on, but my grandmother used to sit in the room and tell me stories, and as do my mom sit and tell us stories. And I sit with my daughters and tell stories. It's just a way of communicating the past to the future generation. It's just speaking your truths and sharing that on with the next generation. And with myself, we have this bucket of all the different photos. I have them from the time they was born to present and their children. So when we pull out this bucket, everyone knows it's story time because each picture has a story. So we all just share in that bucket and we share those stories. And anyone that comes around get pulled into those stories and pulled into the pictures and all of that stuff. So that's how we develop, that's how I believe storytelling came to me. And I'm passing that on to my daughters and their friends or anyone who's around listening to the stories. I believe it was a way of passage and sharing past information that we needed to know as a family.
Thank you both. Lots to talk about here and good questions. Amanda, did you want to?
Yeah, and I apologize for having to come in a little bit late. I was actually facilitating another conversation on community engaged learning where we were talking about reflection. I think storytelling is an amazing form of reflection. But one of the things that came up that kind of also connects was we were talking about how the role memory plays in that practice of reflection. And so Faith, when you kind of were talking about how memory gets, how that comes up in storytelling too, I just thought it might be interesting to unpack that a little bit, because I think right, memory is so important. It's an incredibly valuable type of knowledge. It's something that we want to bring. It's a truth, Jessica, as you often talk about, right? And so often it can often get underplayed as value. It can get to say, oh, it's just your memory doesn't remember things correct. Like, what does that mean, right? Like, what does that even mean in terms? And then I think when you add the storytelling element to it, I think that's just interesting. So that's just what it was making me thinking. That's kind of what this conversation has been making me think about, just in terms of where I came from with this really interesting conversation of how do you move from memory to processing that or making meaning out of that, and then how do you move from that to action, was kind of what we were talking about in this previous conversation. So I wondered if you had some thoughts about that in terms of your own storytelling, right, as a way of using memory for action. I don't know. It's kind of where I am.
Well, I believe maybe that's a part of why they chose, my ancestors chose storytelling to pass down things, because the memory will, fade, it will lax. And I believe each generation put their own spin on it, but I believe the message stays the same. The message that they want the next generation to have will always be in that story, but everyone put their little spin on it, I believe.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So at the latter part of the year, I had an accident, and so a portion of my memory is actually not with me. So I literally am reliving and remembering these stories as they're written. And so the thing that I think is really interesting is, right, learning about which parts of the mind turn off and turn on. And so for me, the things that I remember are the things that I have an emotional connection to, right? So I can remember thumbing through the New York Newsday to find the ad. I can remember, salient parts of my summer activities. I remember my mom telling me, like, I don't care what you read, you just need to read something during the summer every day, right? So even this morning, as I'm talking to my mom and I have a niece who's 5, I was like, are you making her read every day? Because I remember having to do that, right? So those are the things. And so then when we look for the thread in our lives of where literacy became important, we can thumb back and remember, right? That's where that seed was planted. My parents were really big advocates of making sure that we didn't experience summer learning loss. And so they told us, hey, school's out, but you still have to read something every day, right? Even for an hour, find something to read. And they didn't care. Sometimes it was the New York Newsday. Other times it was whatever magazine was in the house. It could have been Essence Magazine, Jet, Ebony. But it was really important to them that I spent the time doing the reading part. And at grade level, that was the other caveat with the asterisk 2 times next to it. So yeah, I think that the things that we remember we're emotionally connected to, and then those are the things that we then carry on with us and continue to duplicate.
This is Amanda, the question's important and opens up, there's so many things we could talk about for so long here. One thing I'd like to add, I have been getting a reinforcement this summer. I'm immersing myself in Indigenous storytelling and literatures about Indigenous storytelling now. And I'm seeing something, being reacquainted actually with something there that I've been holding on to as a really important principle or truth in this process. I'll use the word truth in telling it actually. We are in the academic world and in culture, in the dominant cultures in places like the United States, we are very interested in capital T truth, right? We do all of this science and research, and we're all interested in truth. Courts of law, and when you go to the courtroom, you are looking for truth, what actually happened. Well, what's interesting about storytelling is that's actually not really what storytelling is about at its best. It's not about capital T truth. And so when all of us tell stories, we embellish, we elaborate. We know, sometimes we know we're doing it when we do it, and we do it for dramatic effect, to drive a point home. Well, what is the point that we're trying to drive home? This is captured to me by a sentence from a book on oral history that I've read by one of the masters of oral history. This person said, don't confuse what he referred to as the telling of the truth with what he called the truth of the telling. And so what makes storytelling so beautiful and wonderful is that it enables us to tell truths that we can only communicate if they're embedded in these rich, elaborate stories. And reading the Indigenous storytelling traditions, I mean, what could be more elaborate than the way the world is animated, trees and plants and animals, the origin stories of the world and the universe in Indigenous cultures. Are we looking for capital T truths when we go to that? Expecting that this is exactly how this happened exactly. No, we're not looking at that. We're looking for a truth in the telling. This collection in this book that we did, together contains so much powerful truth of the telling. All of it is embedded in relating experiences of things that actually happened. So there's a lot of truth. There's a lot of telling of the truth too, but both of those things are going on. So memory allows us to hold on to something that actually happened in a truth sense, but then communicating that memory by storying it always involves elaboration of some kind and filling in empty spaces of things we forgot about. but we do that to really bring it to life. And by doing that, we're able to drive a point home, to do perform the truth of the telling. So this is really, it's just so rich and powerful what happens here. And sitting in the academic world where I sit, we still have a lot of work to do to sort of defend the meaning and value and significance of storytelling and stories against people who are looking for the capital T truth, who only want to use scientific methods to figure out exactly what happened in some kind of statistically significant statistics, multiple regression statistics formula. And there's value in doing that kind of work, but there's a different kind of value in doing this kind of storytelling and using stories to do truths of the telling, to communicate truths and to see insights. And mostly the work that we did was in that arena, that students were able to see and learn and be moved by truths. The storytellers were able to communicate a truth by using this, by being invited to tell stories rather than to speak in a different way.
Scott, we have a question from Shauna on the text. All right, Shauna, would you just like to ask that question?
Sure. I was just wondering how, Jamila and Jessica, you foresee using the stories in your community-based work, if there are kind of ways that you see this kind of integrating and supporting the work that you're doing with communities.
I think for a long time, I just would introduce students at the university and faculty and sometimes staff and orient them to the work that I do. This, book allows for folks to do some of that pre-work and then still to have a form of introduction. For the young people that I work with in community, it's super duper important for them to know my full story, right? How I come to the work, how I orient myself to the work, and what things are really matter to me and what my core purpose is. And so I think strategically I'll be utilizing the book in that way. I'd also like to find a version where I'm reading the story so that people get a sense of my actual voice. I know that Scott was sharing that some folks don't have the luxury of being able to be in relationship with each of us as community leaders, and that there's something about hearing someone speak their own words that's really incredible. And so I also want to lend that part to it, because the way that I can speak to my students that I do have a relationship with will be really incredible. So I'm hoping to use it in that way. And for, teachers, whether they be here in this district or in other districts around the country, that they can utilize these stories to help. I do come from a helping profession, right? In education, where we utilize stories in classrooms everywhere, right? And so I would encourage for folks to be able to utilize it in that way, and certainly in their community work.
Well, for myself, in this community, I I used to and still do use storytelling from the different women, that when we come together, we share our stories to build a camaraderie between us. Because once we start hearing that we all share certain things that we experience in our lives, that brings us closer together. So I still use storytelling for that. And my future endeavors, I hope to use storytelling, like some of the stories in this book, it will be able to help me share what I'm trying to put out in this community now. And that's the community gardens. I tried my hand back when the book was getting started. I tried my hand at a garden in my yard, and I loved it. And to this day, I'm still continuing with that garden. And I want to share that with especially mothers. Once we all learn, and I think a lot of them speak in a book, how to do from seed to supper. I think that's going to be important for the mothers to know, and then pass it on to their children, of how to supply your own food, as we did in the past. So that's how I continue to try to use this book in the community in my future endeavors.
Great. Thank you, Jamila. Thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome.
I'm just wondering, just see if there's one last questions or comments I would like to make before we close up the session.
I just want to say really quickly, the way that I tend to read books nowadays is to just thumb through and sometimes just even turn to a page. And sometimes there's a word that will really resonate with me, that will help me with my day. Sometimes when I'm having a poor day, I usually do that. And so I really encourage you to just, take some time and thumb through and read through, right? Start with one of the stories and just let it, integrate into your spirit. And whatever words are there for you to take them and utilize them and move into action.
Thank you, Jamila. Jessica, do you have last word or?
Yes. With all of you guys coming from the college, I encourage you guys to work, as Scott did and Amy, and work with the students, with individuals such as us from the community, because we only have but so much energy. Once that energy is burnt up, we need to pass this on to someone. We need to share and pass this work on, and someone else has to pick this work up and keep moving with it. So I hope that we establish that relationship more with students from the colleges and each community, not just in Ithaca, also in other communities. So I hope when we take this book on the road, I hope this type of work just catch fire, because it's very, very much needed.
Great. Jessica, thank you so much for that inspiration.
You're welcome.
Inspirational words to really help, wrap up in terms of why we do this. It's beyond just the Civic Leader Fellows, beyond just university community engagement, service learning. It's us being in together. I'm sorry, but maybe later on we can come up with a better phrase or a word to describe this, but it's just really going beyond that in terms of how we can challenge some of the systemic issues that we are all facing, and then the generation, and thinking about the next generation, how they can carrying out the work even better. We really need to leave that legacy for them as well. So I also put in the chat that a way for you to access the book. And please, just as Jamila suggested, thumb through it, take a look at different ones. It's an incredible number of leaders. The stories are available. I also want to just ask that, help us sort of raise more awareness of this amazing, great work that has been done, especially by the Civic Leader Fellows. So now, thank you again, Jessica, and thank you to Jamila, and thanks to Scott for the session. And we are going to move into the next session. We'll have, from the students' perspective on community-based research, that's going to be moderated by Amanda Whitman, joined by Michael Donaway, and also Matthew Ponticello. But before we do that, we probably want to take like a 3-minute stretch. So we'll come back, do what you need to do to raise your arms and just get ready. So we'll come back at 3:06.